To grasp what's unfolding in Venezuela today, you must first understand the nation's century-long trajectory. The current turmoil, military interventions, economic blockades, fractured diplomatic relations represents nothing novel. This is merely the newest installment in a narrative that began when petroleum was initially discovered beneath Lake Maracaibo in 1922. This narrative explores how a singular natural resource can shape a nation's destiny, generating extraordinary riches alongside profound systemic failures, drawing global superpowers into its orbit, and ultimately rendering a country reliant on circumstances beyond its sovereign control. Today, I'll guide you through the economic and geopolitical dynamics that forged modern Venezuela. Not the superficial headlines or political personalities, but the foundational forces, the recurring patterns that transcend individual administrations regardless of who occupies power. Because deposing Maduro fails to address Venezuela's core dilemma. The dilemma is petroleum, and without comprehending this reality, subsequent developments will remain incomprehensible. Let me illustrate how we arrived at this juncture, how Venezuela became a petroleum superpower. In 1914, Caribbean Petroleum completed the Zumaque-1 oil well, now designated MG1, in the Mene Grande field adjacent to Lake Maracaibo. That discovery transformed Venezuela irrevocably. Within 10 years, international petroleum corporations descended upon the nation. Royal Dutch Shell, Gulf Oil, Standard Oil, later rebranded as Exxon, all secured enormous territorial concessions. By 1928, Venezuela had ascended to become the planet's foremost oil exporter. By 1929, the nation was extracting 137 million barrels yearly, establishing itself as the globe's second-largest petroleum producer behind only the United States. This wasn't incremental growth. This was an eruption. Venezuela transitioned from relative international obscurity to global prominence in fewer than 15 years. By 1940, Venezuela ranked as the world's third-largest oil producer, extracting over 27 million tons annually. Throughout World War II, serving as a crucial supplier to Allied forces, production surged 42% between 1943 and 1944 alone. Then, in subsequent decades, came the discovery that would crystallize Venezuela's destiny, the Orinoco Belt. The Orinoco Oil Belt, situated in eastern Venezuela, contains what experts now recognize as Earth's largest verified petroleum reserves. According to numerous sources, including the U.S. Geological Survey, the belt harbors an estimated 900 billion to 1.4 trillion barrels of heavy crude in confirmed and unconfirmed deposits. Venezuela's officially certified reserves total approximately 304 billion barrels, roughly 18% of global proven reserves as of 2020. For context, Venezuela possesses more petroleum than Saudi Arabia, more than Russia, more than any other sovereign nation. It represents an almost unfathomable quantity of subterranean wealth. But there's a complication. Venezuelan petroleum is heavy and sulfurous. It's viscous, elevated in sulfur content, challenging to extract and costly to refine. It isn't the light, sweet crude that flows effortlessly and processes economically. Orinoco Petroleum demands specialized refineries, substantial infrastructure, and considerable investment to commercialize profitably. That technical reality influenced everything that followed because merely possessing the resource proved insufficient. Venezuela required foreign capital, foreign technology, and foreign technical knowledge to convert that petroleum into revenue. And that reliance on external entities, on global commodity markets, on decisions formulated far from Caracas, that's what rendered Venezuela susceptible. How petroleum wealth restructured Venezuelan politics. Oil didn't merely transform Venezuela's economy, it fundamentally reorganized the entire political architecture. From the 1920s forward, Venezuela became what economists designate a rentier state, a nation that derives the preponderance of its national revenue from leasing natural resources rather than from manufacturing goods or taxing a diversified economic base. This generates profound consequences. When governmental revenue originates primarily from petroleum exports rather than from taxing citizens, the relationship between state and populace transforms. The government doesn't require productive citizens. It requires resource control. And control it certainly did. During the dictatorship of Juan Vicente Gómez, who governed from 1908 to 1935, oil wealth concentrated within governmental hands and a narrow elite connected to foreign corporations. By 1929, Shell, Gulf Oil, and Exxon accounted for 99% of Venezuela's total petroleum extraction. The wealth proved immense, but it failed to distribute broadly. Agricultural production deteriorated as labor migrated to petroleum fields. By the 1940s, Venezuela was importing foodstuffs despite having previously achieved agricultural self-sufficiency. In 1943, President Isaias Medina Angarita enacted the Hydrocarbons Law. This represented the first substantial step toward governmental assertion of greater control over the petroleum sector. The legislation mandated oil companies share profits approximately 50-50 with the Venezuelan state and stipulated that all petroleum concessions revert to state authority within 40 years. Despite anxieties from foreign corporations that this would devastate the industry, production continued escalating. Venezuela functioned as a massive petroleum supplier throughout World War II and the post-war economic expansion. But the 50-50 division revealed something significant. Oil wealth generates political pressure. Whoever commands the petroleum commands the government, and whoever commands the government commands oil revenue. This dynamic, oil revenue financing the state regulating access to oil revenue, political authority consolidating around that control. This became the blueprint that would characterize Venezuelan politics for the subsequent 80 years. In 1960, Venezuela played a founding role in establishing OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Venezuelan Oil Minister Juan Pablo Pérez Alfonso, troubled by chronically depressed oil prices throughout the 1950s, advocated coordinating with fellow oil-producing nations to stabilize pricing and claim greater authority over global energy markets. This was Venezuela asserting itself as a significant participant in the international energy framework, not merely a supplier, a force. By the 1970s, petroleum accounted for exceeding 90% of Venezuela's export income. The economy had become entirely dependent upon a solitary commodity. And when oil valuations soared during the 1973 petroleum crisis, Venezuela's revenue detonated. That wealth financed massive governmental expenditure, infrastructure initiatives, social programming, subsidization. The Venezuelan government evolved into the principal economic entity within the nation, distributing oil wealth through state employment and public amenities. But this constructed a structural predicament. When petroleum prices elevate, the government can spend liberally. When oil prices decline, the entire apparatus implodes. There exists no diversified taxation foundation. There exists no manufacturing sector generating independent income. There exists only petroleum, and if oil revenue diminishes, everything halts. This is the resource curse. Tremendous wealth from a single commodity establishes economic dependency, undermines alternative industries, and renders the entire nation vulnerable to price fluctuations it cannot regulate. And it cultivates corruption, because when the government regulates access to billions in oil revenue, the incentive to capture that control through elections, through coups, through patronage systems becomes irresistible. Oil didn't merely finance the Venezuelan government, it defined it. The 1976 nationalization and the establishment of PDVSA. In 1976, Venezuela nationalized its petroleum industry. President Carlos Andrés Pérez enacted legislation transferring ownership of all oil operations to state control and establishing Petróleos de Venezuela S.A., PDVSA, as the National Petroleum Corporation. Foreign companies like Exxon, Gulf Oil, and Mobil, which had invested exceeding $5 billion in Venezuelan oil infrastructure, received what was characterized as marginal compensation. The epoch of direct foreign dominion concluded. PDVSA became one of the planet's largest and most technically proficient oil corporations. At its zenith, it operated refineries, administered complex logistics, and exported petroleum to dozens of nations. Venezuelan petroleum engineers ranked among the industry's most skilled practitioners. But nationalization also meant PDVSA became a political instrument. Its revenue didn't flow to shareholders, it flowed to the Venezuelan government. And that meant every administration possessed an incentive to utilize PDVSA as a funding mechanism for political initiatives. Throughout the 1980s, oil valuations collapsed. The global petroleum surplus caused by amplified production, diminished demand, and enhanced energy efficiency in developed economies devastated Venezuela's economy. By 1992, 4 of every 5 Venezuelans subsisted in poverty. The 1990s witnessed attempts to reopen the petroleum sector to private investment. PDVSA executed joint ventures with foreign corporations. Production increased, but political tensions persisted because oil wealth remained the prize. And whoever controlled the government controlled PDVSA. Then, in 1999, Hugo Chavez assumed the presidency, and everything shifted. Chavez and the politicization of PDVSA. Hugo Chavez campaigned on a platform of utilizing Venezuela's petroleum wealth to finance social programming for impoverished populations. He termed it the Bolivarian Revolution, and he meant it literally. In the early 2000s, Chavez moved to assert direct political authority over PDVSA. When PDVSA management resisted, he terminated them. In 2002 and 2003, during a national strike and attempted coup, thousands of PDVSA workers abandoned their positions. Chavez responded by dismissing approximately 18,000 employees, nearly half the corporation's workforce. Many terminated workers were engineers, geologists, and technical specialists. They were substituted with political loyalists possessing minimal or zero experience in the petroleum sector. This eviscerated PDVSA's technical capability. The corporation that had once ranked among the world's most competent became a patronage apparatus. Political allegiance mattered more than professional expertise. Simultaneously, Chavez diverted enormous quantities of PDVSA revenue to finance social programs, missions, as he designated them, housing, healthcare, education, food subsidies. Oil funds flowed directly into these initiatives, circumventing normal budgetary procedures. When petroleum prices spiked in the mid-2000s, exceeding $100 per barrel, Venezuela's revenue exploded. Between 1998 and 2008, the government collected approximately $325 billion from petroleum production and exports. That capital financed an expansion of governmental programs, subsidies, and state economic control. But when oil valuations declined again starting in 2014, the system collapsed. PDVSA couldn't sustain production because it lacked investment, technical proficiency, and functional infrastructure. Equipment malfunctioned. Wells went offline. Production plummeted. Oil output, which had peaked exceeding 3 million barrels daily in the late 1990s, fell below 900,000 barrels daily by 2024. That's a collapse exceeding 70%. And accompanying that collapse came economic catastrophe, hyperinflation, food scarcity, medical supply shortages, mass emigration. By 2024, over 7 million Venezuelans had fled the nation. This wasn't merely mismanagement. This was the predictable consequence of transforming a national oil corporation into a political instrument. When technical competence is supplanted with political loyalty, when revenue is diverted to finance governmental spending rather than reinvested in infrastructure, production collapses. And once production collapses, the entire rentier-state structure fails because without oil revenue, nothing remains. The United States and Venezuela, an oil relationship. Now, let's discuss the United States, because U.S.-Venezuela relations have perpetually centered on petroleum. In the early 20th century decades, American corporations, Gulf Oil, Standard Oil, others, dominated Venezuelan petroleum extraction. They drafted the legislation, negotiated the concessions, and exported the crude. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, despite political disagreements, oil commerce persisted. In 2008, Venezuela exported approximately 1.2 million barrels daily to the United States. Then came Chavez, and the relationship deteriorated. Chavez condemned U.S. foreign policy, formed partnerships with Cuba and other anti-American administrations, and weaponized oil politically. He threatened to terminate exports to the U.S. He sold petroleum at discounted rates to Caribbean nations and impoverished American communities to construct political support. But the petroleum continued flowing because Venezuela needed the revenue, and U.S. refineries along the Gulf Coast were specifically engineered to process Venezuelan heavy crude. In 2014, under the Obama administration, the United States commenced imposing targeted sanctions on Venezuelan officials accused of human rights violations. These expanded in 2017 and 2018 under Trump to include financial sanctions, restrictions on PDVSA, and eventually a near-total embargo on Venezuelan petroleum imports. By 2020, U.S. imports of Venezuelan crude had diminished to nearly zero, and Venezuela's oil production, already declining, fell further still. The sanctions were engineered to pressure the Maduro government. The rationale was cut off oil revenue, the government collapses, democracy returns. But that didn't materialize. Instead, Venezuela redirected its exports to China, to India, to alternative buyers willing to purchase sanctioned petroleum at steep discounts through networks of dark fleet tankers. The petroleum continued moving, just not to the United States. And that brings us to China. China's energy strategy and why Venezuela mattered. China's economy demands enormous energy quantities, and as China expanded over the past 3 decades, it needed to secure reliable petroleum supplies from multiple sources. Beginning in the early 2000s, China commenced investing heavily in Venezuela. According to multiple reports, China extended exceeding $60 billion in loans to Venezuela between 2007 and 2016. These loans were repaid in petroleum. Venezuela shipped crude to China at discounted rates as loan repayment. This proved strategic for both nations. Venezuela needed capital to sustain oil production and finance governmental programs. China needed long-term access to energy supplies that wouldn't be subject to U.S. authority. By the 2010s, China had become Venezuela's largest creditor and one of its largest petroleum customers. When U.S. sanctions severed Venezuelan access to Western financial systems, China provided an alternative. This wasn't charity, this was energy security. China was constructing a portfolio of oil suppliers, Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Angola, Venezuela, so that no single disruption could cripple its economy. Venezuela, with its massive reserves and willingness to sell at discounts, fit perfectly into that strategy. And here's where geopolitical competition becomes transparent. The United States didn't just want to pressure Maduro, it wanted to deny China access to Western Hemisphere petroleum. It wanted to maintain authority over global energy flows and ensure that Venezuela's reserves, if developed, would serve U.S. interests, not Chinese ones. This is why the current operation occurred. Not because Maduro is uniquely malevolent, but because Venezuela's petroleum, situated 90 miles from the U.S. mainland, represents a strategic asset, and the United States determined it couldn't permit that asset to remain under control of a government aligned with China. How U.S. sanctions and oil competition influenced the crisis. So what did sanctions actually accomplish? They disrupted Venezuelan petroleum exports, they made it more difficult for PDVSA to operate, they reduced governmental revenue, production fell from exceeding 2 million barrels daily in 2014 to below 900,000 barrels daily in 2024. But they didn't collapse the government. They didn't restore democracy. They didn't stop petroleum from flowing. What they accomplished was redirecting the oil trade. Venezuela ceased selling to the United States and commenced selling to China, India, and others. The buyers changed, the flows adapted, the market discovered a way, and in the process, sanctions rendered Venezuela more dependent on China, not less. Because when Western financial systems and markets are closed, countries turn to alternatives, and the primary alternative is China. This is the unintended consequence. U.S. sanctions were supposed to weaken adversaries. Instead, they pushed those adversaries into closer alignment with each other. Venezuela, Iran, Russia, countries under U.S. sanctions, all deepened their economic ties with China. They constructed alternative payment systems. They traded in yuan instead of dollars. They created networks that bypass U.S. financial control. The sanctions didn't isolate these countries. They integrated them into a China-led economic sphere. And from China's perspective, this was optimal. Sanctions created opportunities. Countries desperate for buyers would sell at discounts. Countries locked out of Western systems would embrace Chinese alternatives. So when we discuss why the current U.S. operation happened, we need to understand this context. Economic pressure through sanctions wasn't working. The government wasn't collapsing. China's access wasn't being denied. So the United States escalated from economic pressure to military action, from sanctions to airstrikes, from attempting to control the petroleum through financial means to attempting to control it through force. Why removing Maduro was never sufficient. And this brings us to the fundamental problem. Removing Maduro doesn't resolve Venezuela's structural issues because Venezuela's problem isn't one individual. It's oil dependency. Oil dependency creates a political system where controlling the government means controlling immense wealth. That attracts corruption. It attracts authoritarianism. It attracts foreign interference. It doesn't matter who governs Venezuela. As long as oil revenue is the only revenue that matters, as long as the government controls that revenue, as long as political power is tied to access to oil wealth, the same dynamics will recur. You could install a democratic government tomorrow, but if that government still depends on oil revenue to function, if it still faces the same pressures, declining production, price volatility, foreign competition, corruption, it will face the same challenges Maduro faced and Chavez before him and every Venezuelan government since the 1920s. This is the resource curse in action. The wealth is genuine, but the wealth creates dependency, and dependency creates vulnerability. Consider Norway. Norway has massive petroleum reserves, but Norway constructed a sovereign wealth fund. It invested oil revenue instead of spending it. It maintained a diversified economy. It created institutions that prevented oil wealth from corrupting the political system. Venezuela did the opposite. It spent oil revenue as rapidly as it arrived. It allowed PDVSA to become a political tool. It undermined every other economic sector until nothing else functioned. And now, even if a new government assumes power, even if production increases, even if foreign investment returns, the structural forces remain. The temptation to use oil revenue for short-term political gain, the pressure from foreign powers who want access to that petroleum, the corruption that accompanies controlling billions of dollars in resource wealth. Removing Maduro was never going to solve those problems because those problems are built into the system. Venezuela as a case study. So what does Venezuela teach us? It teaches us that resource wealth is not equivalent to sustainable prosperity. Possessing petroleum doesn't make a country wealthy, it makes it dependent. It teaches us that economic structures matter more than individuals. You can remove leaders, but if the underlying economic system remains unchanged, the same problems will recur. It teaches us that sanctions have limitations. You can disrupt commerce, but you can't control markets. When you close off one route, the market constructs another. It teaches us that geopolitical competition over resources is intensifying. The contest between the United States and China isn't just about military power. It's about access to energy, control over supply chains, and influence over resource-rich nations. And it teaches us that oil dependency creates political dysfunction. When governmental revenue comes from a single commodity rather than from a productive, diversified economy, the incentives are all wrong. The focus shifts from building institutions and empowering citizens to controlling the resource and distributing its wealth. This is Venezuela's tragedy. It has more petroleum than almost any nation on earth, and that petroleum has made it poorer, not richer, more vulnerable, not more powerful, more dependent, not more independent. The current crisis isn't an aberration. It's the continuation of a pattern that's been repeating for a century. Oil wealth attracts foreign powers. Foreign powers compete for access. Governments use oil revenue to maintain power. Production declines when political control matters more than technical competence. The economy collapses when oil prices fall. The cycle repeats. And now, with Maduro in U.S. custody, with the government in transition, with foreign powers maneuvering for position, the cycle continues. Because until Venezuela breaks its dependence on petroleum, until it diversifies its economy, builds functioning institutions independent of oil revenue, creates political systems that don't revolve around controlling a single resource, nothing will fundamentally change. The names will change, the governments will change, but the underlying forces that created this crisis, those remain. And that's the lesson, not just for Venezuela, but for every nation that depends on resource wealth to survive. Dependence is vulnerability, and vulnerability in a world of great power competition is dangerous. Venezuela wasn't doomed by petroleum, but petroleum made Venezuela vulnerable, and that vulnerability has been exploited repeatedly by internal actors and foreign powers alike. The question now is whether the next government, whoever leads it, however it's formed, can break that cycle, whether Venezuela can finally build an economy that doesn't revolve around a single commodity, whether it can create institutions that serve its citizens rather than whoever controls the oil revenue. History suggests that's unlikely. Resource dependency is extraordinarily difficult to overcome. The incentives are too powerful, the wealth is too concentrated, the corruption is too entrenched, but it's not impossible. Other nations have accomplished it. It requires deliberate policy choices, strong institutions, and the political will to resist the temptation to spend oil revenue on short-term gains. Whether Venezuela can do that remains to be seen. But one thing is clear: removing Maduro was only the beginning. The real challenge, breaking the cycle of oil dependency, has barely started. And until that challenge is met, Venezuela's crisis will continue in one form or another, with one leader or another, because the problem isn't who runs Venezuela, the problem is what Venezuela runs on.